Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
This is our podcast about sailing the East Coast of the United States. In some episodes, we focus on passages and destinations. And in other episodes, we talk about boats, equipment, and techniques. And when we come across an interesting person, we try to get them to be a guest on the show. But before we dive into this episode, we need to say a special thank you to our supporters. Several listeners are supporting the podcast using Patreon. If you'd like to join them, you can go to patreon.com/Sailing the East.
And Bela, it is much appreciated. We appreciate our listeners and people who are supporting us, and a big thanks. But let's move on to today's topic. And this is the second part. We started in episode 88, and now we're finishing up in episode 89. Correct, Bela?
That's right. So this is about Simon and Sawyer sailing across the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. Back in episode 84 and 85, we interviewed them and they talked about their preparations for sailing across the Atlantic. And then in episode 88 was sort of their first leg. We sort of broke, it was a long conversation, so we broke it into two. And episode 88, we talked about certain things like seasickness, some equipment failures, making water, etc. And in this episode, we're going to talk to them about some of the other things they encountered along the trip.
Yeah, Bela, this is so cool. I'm excited to hear the second part of the conversation. Now, again, for new or irregular listeners, we would recommend before you listen to this episode, start with 84 and 85 about the planning, and then listen to 88 for part one of this conversation, and then this one. So if you jump right into this one, you might be a little bit lost. So 84, 85, then 88, and then come back to this one. And I think you'll be, it'll be very valuable to do that. So let's get right to the second part of the conversation with Simon and Sawyer, direct from the Azores Islands.
So let me ask you this: was there a piece of equipment that you really thought was going to be super important? Like, we got to have this, we got to spend the money on this, and you didn't even take it out of the box. I mean, other than the life raft, right? But I mean, like something that you said, we just really wasted our money on this. It turns out we don't need this at all. Was there anything like that?
I mean, no, the only things were in that safety vein, which we're very happy we didn't use, right? So yeah, we have a really big sea anchor, spent a lot of money on, and we got all the right rigging for it. That stayed luckily underneath the V-berth. We have a really fancy, nice drogue, and that didn't come out. And we have an emergency rudder, and that didn't come out. So in those types of things, we spent a lot of money on that. But we might need it in the future, and we're definitely happy we had it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I would like hazard a couple other things. So we had a Solent stay installed.
Oh, that's a good point.
An inner Solent stay, and then a working jib, and
a storm jib.
And a storm jib, yeah. And we didn't have to use those. So we used the Solent, the working jib on one day, for a little bit, and it's nice. It's a good sail, but it didn't come up. The roller furler Genoa is easier.
Yeah.
And then we also have our SSB system that's been around for a while. The radio is like $900. The antenna system was a few $100.
Yeah.
And we didn't really use it, but it works, right? I mean, we sent you an email with the SSB. It's a good backup. It's fully independent.
Yeah, we listened to some of the nets one night.
Yeah.
It was just kind of interesting, but
I think all these things were they have a use, and it's reassuring that we have them.
Yeah.
But we definitely, all in that same vein, we definitely could have made the crossing without them.
Yeah.
Luckily, right?
Yeah,
we didn't need the SSB, we didn't need the working jib, we didn't need the storm jib, etc.
Yeah, but I'm traded it. I'm glad we had all that stuff. So
yeah.
So were there any things like, well, I plan to read 5 books on this passage because I know, and you saw none of them.
So I bought 4 1,000-page each books before I left, thinking, this is a time in my life where I can actually be War and Peace, right? And I tried reading one once. I read about half a page, and I almost lost my lunch, and I put it back. So, no, I didn't. I think so. One thing was part. I didn't really read, even though you're sitting on the boat for 24 hours. Like, what are you doing? No, I couldn't read. And then we had all this very extravagant food planning. We talked a little bit about last time. And we did make some meals, my wife was always texting us being like, oh, what's for dinner tonight? You know, we would kind of start saying like, yeah, like powdered tomato soup and crackers. So yeah, we, you know, we had all the food and it was nice we had it, but we didn't spend as much time making, you know, gourmet food as we thought we would.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, that was it. I think, so I don't know if I mentioned last time, we actually had all of our standing rigging replaced before we left.
Yeah.
Ours looked in really good condition, but it was one of those things that, you know, you don't really know, and probably a good insurance policy to get that replaced. And I was very happy we did, just because when it was really blowing and the boat's creaking and heeled over, you know, I really wasn't worried about that. And I think that if we had not changed that rigging, that would have added another, you know, significant amount of anxiety, right? Like, what's going to snap? We've actually seen 2 boats come in here in Horta since I've been here with stays that have snapped.
Yeah.
And they had to like limp their way in.
Yeah.
I know those are the ones that made it.
We haven't heard from the others yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So since we're talking about hardware, what other things sort of broke, right? Because you're on this trip that is as you know, that's probably 5 or 6 years of sailing compacted into 17 days. So
No, absolutely. Well, so the first thing that I think was pretty new to us as, you know, coastal sailors originally is anything that can chafe will chafe. And it'll chafe straight through. I think as you know, coastal sailors, we get kind of used to being sloppy because you're only sailing for a few hours during the day, and then the next day it's a different setup, so things actually don't really like cause a problem. But we had several lines just chafe straight through. Like we had well, we lost our topping lift twice, but the second time it was because the line for the topping lift, you know, which is like a nylon line, was wrapped kind of the wrong way around one of our reefing lines, and it wasn't under a whole lot of tension, right? When we were sailing, the main is acting as the topping lift, so the topping lift just flipped around, and you know, we were reefed a decent amount, but we didn't think it was going to matter. But just having the 2 ropes on each other like this wore straight through the topping lift in like 3 days, right? And that's not something that you're used to.
yeah. So does that mean somebody went up the mast out in the seas?
A little bit.
Well, I lost you there. So the last thing I heard was 2 ropes wore right through, and the topping lift wore right through.
Yeah. So the topping, it was just 2 ropes touching each other, right? And in like 3 days, the topping lift wore straight through. Where, you know, we look up, like, where'd the topping lift go? And it's flailing around, and we had the main sheet chafe. It didn't chafe all the way through, but we did have to replace it. And that was because it was hitting just like a little corner on our boom brake. You know, we've had that set up for 3 years now.
Yeah.
And it has never been an issue, right? Because, you know, how often are we really sailing with the main? But, you know, when you have the main up for 5 days, it doesn't take much. So all those little things.
Yeah, and it's not just the amount of time. It's, you know, it's 400 some hours across, right? But it's everything was under a lot of load for that time. I mean, basically under full load at 20, 25 knots the entire time. And the sea state, you know, it's 8, 10, 12-foot waves. So there's a lot of motion.
Yeah.
And it's constantly moving. I don't know, probably a million times, right? That thing went like this.
Sure.
And, so yeah, that's true. That was a little bit unexpected for us. And also, I remember we went out on deck one day, and just to kind of check one of the lines, and we noticed that a D-shackle, like the little, what do you call it?
That's right, it's D-shackle.
Yeah, but the little bolt that goes through the D-shackle was like almost about to come out, like 1 thread away, because we hadn't tied it off with some wire. So we're like, oh, we should do that. So we started checking all the D-shackles, and they were all like that, right? Anything that we had not tied was about to fall apart.
Yeah.
Well, so that, you know, I think it extends to, you know, one of our larger mechanical issues for the whole trip was our vang. Our vang just kept breaking, our hard vang, and you know, for various different reasons. But ultimately, it can be traced back to it wasn't a great installation, you know, relative to the amount of load that it has. But the other thing too is, you know, when we're sailing in light wind, it's really rolly, but the main isn't under a whole lot of pressure. Oftentimes we're sailing downwind, And so as the boat rolls, the main is going back and forth and back and forth, and it puts an incredible amount of load on the boom. And as it hits the main sheet, or the other way, when it hits our boom brake, which we have cranked on as the jibe preventer, it puts a ton of load on the vang. And yeah, so like the first time we had the bolt, there's a gooseneck bolt for the hard vang that connects it to the boom, that came off and we landed on the deck. Then the second time we had the D-shackle come off, and then the vang released, and then we had the metal plates that secure the vang to the boom. Those pulled off, so then we re-riveted them. Then they pulled off again. Then it was kind of stormy, so we couldn't go back out there. So then those metal plates wore a hole in the mast and wore a hole in the mast boot, and we got water coming. So it was a we sailed the last week of the trip with no vang, right?
The boom was nice, actually. So then pitch for the boom brake. Stops. It's a jibe preventer. It allows you to jibe without bringing the main in. You can actually adjust the tension, but it did actually serve basically as a backup vang for us. Keep the boom down.
Yeah, you're not going to get a good sail shape, but it stopped the boom from flailing all over the boat.
Yeah, sure.
And we got here, and we have this gorgeous piece of art, new vang bracket. A guy fabbed here on the island, and instead of having 8 rivets in the front, this new bracket goes all the way around the mast, and it's got 16 rivets going through the side, and it's probably, if we watch up on the rocks, the last thing that will be connected will be this bracket.
Yeah. So when you lost your topping lift, did somebody have to go up the mast out there?
So in that case, the topping lift got tangled around one of the shrouds, but we were able to get it untangled from the deck. I did have to climb up the mast twice. Really, only one time was really necessary. The second time, I wanted to try and get our flags set up, our spreader flags. Now, the first time that was important was the halyard for our Solent, for our working jib, that got all tangled up in. What did it get tangled up in? It got tangled in something else.
Yeah, I think in the topping lift.
The topping lift for our whisker pole.
Our whisker pole, yeah. So then we couldn't use our whisker pole. It was all, again, so many motions, right? Anything that can get tangled is going to get tangled pretty quickly, and you're not going to be able to untangle it easily.
Yeah.
So that was a trip up the mast. So yeah, maybe that's another important takeaway. Like, you should be prepared to go up the mast if you haven't done it. There's easy ways and hard ways to go up the mast. We were pretty lucky that we have steps built into it.
Yeah.
So it's really just a matter of climbing up there. If you can get a real climbing harness, or some sort of harness that's designed to allow for full movement. So in our case, we just use the harness that's built into our life jacket. Then that's definitely the way to go. They sell these bosun chairs as well.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, I think the only folks who have used the bosun chair are the folks who have never climbed a mast, because you can't move when you're in it. You just have to sit there and get winched all the way up, but you can't use your legs, right?
Yeah.
And so something like a climbing harness you can buy an outdoor store, an REI or whatever, Ella Bean, right? I would recommend that for anybody.
I think the harness and the life vest work pretty well.
Yeah.
And we're wearing it anyway, so it wasn't too complicated.
Yeah, I have a bosun's chair that I would describe as a regular mountain climbing harness with a seat in it.
Yeah.
And some pockets. So you feel like you can climb just like you would on a climbing harness, but you can also sit in it, and it's pretty comfortable. It's not like sitting in a regular, climbing harness, and it's got some nice big pockets on it. I don't know who makes it, but it's sort of combination of those things, as opposed to just a piece of wood that you're sort of sitting on. Yeah. So you have stairs on the mast then, or steps. So you went up that.
Yeah, we have these fold out.
Pull out
step. Yeah, and it's great. We look around here on the dock. Actually, very few boats have them. So we've only seen one or two others that have it. It's really nice to have.
But even so, I'll say that we've seen a lot of folks go up the mast in Horta, right?
Yeah. Almost everybody.
Almost you come down on the dock, and at least somebody's up there doing something, right? It's a very.
So yeah, here's the difference, Bela. It's kind of, maybe it's obvious, but it's kind of cool. When you come to the dock here, right? Just like when we left Newport, everyone's out on their boat. In Newport, everyone's out waxing their boat, buffing their boat.
Yes.
And here people are taking apart their roller furler. They're up the mast trying to like change the block. I mean, you're busy. You got to stay busy, but it's different kind of busy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there aren't any shiny boats here. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah. You're fixing stuff.
Yeah.
So what other things were sort of? Oh, I didn't expect that to break.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we got a good story for you.
Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So I'd say the biggest equipment failure drama we had was related to our furling jib. Yeah, we were mostly sailing, with our main up and our jib out, and then often the jib was out on a whisker pole.
Mm-hmm.
And so one day, we have a forecast, and the forecast was calling for like 20 knots behind us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're watching it, and it's getting to like 20. We had a full main and a full Genoa out, which we could handle pretty well. And then 20 becomes 22, becomes 25, becomes 28. And of course, you should have brought the sails down a little bit, but you're kind of hoping that it just goes back down, and of course it doesn't. So then it's 30, it's 32, and that's when Sawyer mentioned like you kind of know when the boat's not happy. I think the boat kind of did a surf down a wave at like 9 knots or 10 knots. We both looked at each other.
We're like, yeah, it's time to.
We gotta change something here. So we had gotten used to actually furling in the jib with the whisker pole to reduce that sail. Even under load, we can take some of the load off it.
Yeah.
And then working together, we can kind of bring it in a little bit.
So yeah, and I'll just like explain this scenario a little bit in more detail here. So, we got the main out on the port side, and we got the Genoa pulled out on the starboard side with the whisker pole, and the wind is coming off of our starboard quarter, right? So we have the whisker pole and the Genoa into the wind, and so normally what would be the prudent thing to do, and what the whisker pole manufacturers will tell you to do, is you should jibe the main over, so then the Genoa is in the lee of the main, and then you can furl it in without really any tension.
Without too much pressure.
And then you jibe back. But the problem is, we're sailing downwind in like 15-foot seas and 30 knot, like almost gale force winds, and we don't feel like jibing the main. We just didn't want to do it. So we had kind of, with the two of us, we over time figured out how we can kind of cheat the system, and it is possible to furl in the Genoa under that load, but it requires a lot of coordination.
Yeah.
And it does put a lot of strain on the furler, as we found out.
Yeah. So anyway, so Sawyer, releases the sheet a little bit. That's the way we do it, and then gives me a little bit to pull in. So I go to pull in, and it's kind of stiff. So I really pull in, and then all the line comes. I was like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, I have all this line in my lap, and the sail's still out. And of course you're exhausted, and so I'm like, wow, what's going on here? So I pull some more, but it's still not getting any better, right? So we come to realize, of course, that so we've pulled the line in because the drum is turning, but the drum is no longer connected to the furler. So something's broken there, and now our Genoa's out with the whisker pole, and our main's up, and it's 30, 32 knots and 12-foot seas
and building,
and okay, we know how to get the main down, right? But how do we get this giant Genoa in when the only way to get it in really is this drum that's no longer working, right? So, so Sawyer's like, all right, we need to get a diagram. Like, go downstairs, see if you can find like the manual. Maybe it'll be obvious like what broke, right? We didn't want to go up on deck right away. We didn't have to. So I go down. I'm like ripping through the manual. I was like, I can't find it.
Yeah.
So we go back up. It's okay. We got to go out and just do like a little scouting mission, right? See what's going on. So I get all tethered up and crawl out there. And when I got to the furler, I could see that they were disconnected. So that wasn't. I thought maybe a weld broke or something. I didn't know how they got together. And I looked down, and right on the roller for the anchor, maybe an inch from going to the water, was this little screw, a little set screw. So like, that's interesting. What was more interesting is I had seen that same set screw the day before somewhere else on the deck.
It's like sitting in our deck drain, caught in the filter. Yeah.
So important lesson is if you find a screw on your boat, don't just say, "Oh, that's interesting." You have to hunt down where that screw came from. So we did spend like an hour, trying to find where that screw came from, and we looked everywhere. And I think maybe that was one time we went to Mass. We were trying to see maybe some block or something. We couldn't find it, so we had convinced ourselves, "Oh, it must have been a screw that came off another boat when we were in the yard last winter. It's probably nothing." Well, that other screw was also from the roller furler, and then the third one was gone. So those 3 set screws had come on, vibrated out over the course of a week, and now, they weren't connected anymore. But the good news was we knew what the problem was. So I had 1 set screw, I had the one from before in the drawer, and then we dug through our hardware store and got a third one that was close enough, got back up there, put them back in, taped all around it so they wouldn't come back out, and we were back in business. But certainly kind of, anxiety producing, and I think, real lesson that you can't assume that what is going to work is going to work.
Yeah.
Right. So our really only out in that condition was to roll in the jib. But if that doesn't work, I guess, we could have tried to take down the jib. Right. But that would have been really not fun. And we could have tried to turn into the wind, but that's also not fun. So we kind of, we lucked out.
I think that was like the most important lesson of all was, we hadn't given ourselves a great plan B, right? We had waited until the winds had built up pretty far, and then we went out on deck prepared to furl in the Genoa and not really prepared to do anything else. Right. And so then when that failed, and now it's like we hadn't even thought of what the plan B would be, right? And then, quite frankly, in hindsight, I think we might have done things a little differently. But
so now, in that whole process, we ended up bending a stanchion. We got the lines all tangled up. We got it in. We had to wrestle the main. We got literally like up the mast, breath on the main. We got it done.
We had one of our jib sheets came out, and we were towing that behind the boat for about 2 days. It was like,
So not good. I will say though, and this is good, and Sawyer gets credit for it. So when we first couldn't get it in, and we're like, "Oh my God," Sawyer did say, "Hey, stop. Let's just sit down here and let's just talk about this for a minute, because really nothing's going to change in a minute, And that's where he came up with the plan of, hey, before we get on deck, maybe there's a manual, maybe there's a diagram. Let's go find it so we can go out there and be well prepared. And in the end, something different happened. But if you can, it is good to sort of back to our wilderness first aid, right? Is the person going to die in 5 minutes or not die in 5 minutes? And we were feeling nervous, but a minute wasn't going to change anything. So just take a deep breath and come up with a plan. And our plan didn't work, but
no. But it was good to think.
It was a good exercise.
I remember having the distinct conversation. We're in the cockpit. We're stressed out. We're like, we got to fix this. And I remember saying, well, let's just do the risk reward for a second, right? The risk of not doing anything. Like we could just go straight back downstairs and go to sleep. But the risk is that the wind continues to build, and what is inevitable is just going to be harder. But the reward there is that we don't have to contend with going out on deck in a gale, right? And because the flip side, the reward of going out there is we could fix the solution. We could give us options, so we could furl the sail, we could drop the main down, right? That allows us to go up to, much higher wind speeds. But the risk is that you're up on deck in a gale and big waves, and you get washed overboard. There's that hole, right? And so it was useful just to think it through. And we decided in the end, it's worth it to go up there and try and at least diagnose the issue, if not fix it. But we had thought it through, right? And just stumble into it.
And if you find a screw in your boat, it didn't come from another boat. Don't fool yourself. That came from your boat. You better figure out where the hole is that it used to go into.
Figure that out. That's good advice. Yep. Yeah. As you're talking about that experience, I'm reflecting back, and every time that I have delayed doing something like shortening the sails or putting out my bumpers, my fenders, or whatever it is, right? Getting my dock lines ready. Every time I've delayed, because I was lazy, basically, it's gotten much harder to do subsequently, right? So by delaying it never makes it easier, right? For me, it's always gotten harder.
Sure.
So I always, soon as I start getting that inkling about reefing my sails, I reef my sails.
So
because I know if I don't, it's going to get harder.
Yeah, we may have talked about this in entrepreneurship related things, but one kind of expression I have is that it's impossible to pick the perfect time. So you're either going to be too late or too early,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's what it is, and it's better to be too early than too late.
Right.
And that comes to like changing jobs or
Stock market.
making a big hire. Yeah, sure. Pulling your money out of the stock market.
Right.
I know you're never going to time it perfectly. So, realize that and just go early.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what's next for you guys? Where to next?
Yeah, so our original plan and our primary goal is to get to the British Isles, get to England.
Yeah.
We have family there. We're having a bit of a little reunion. But how do we get there? So our original plan was to sail from here up to Ireland, and then from Ireland to England, and cruise around the British Isles a little bit. But looking at the weather forecast, just doesn't look that great for going to Ireland right now.
No.
This time of year you get these large low pressure systems that stay well north of the Azores, but they really nail you if you're in the vicinity of Ireland, and there's really no easy way to avoid that.
Yeah.
And looking at our forecast for leaving this week, we'd have 2 or 3 days of pretty calm winds, and then 2 or 3 days of pretty nice winds, and then by the time we get into the weekend or early next week, we're looking at beating into 25 knots, 30 knots of wind. So, chatting with some of the other vagabonds on the dock here, we've been convinced to go to Spain. So we're just going to go to that northwest coast of Spain, which is a little bit shorter, a little more east.
Yeah.
And good winds behind us. We can stay out of these lows, and it's supposed to be beautiful. And then once we get there, it's only like a 300-mile hop across the Bay of Biscay. It's an infamous Bay of Biscay for sure, but it's important to remember it's only 300 miles, so it's quite easy to pick a weather window, right?
Yeah.
And then it's like 100 miles to the UK. So again, you can just wait for a good day and then jump across. So we'll do that.
So is the reason you're going to Spain and the Bay of Biscay is that you did not see enough orcas on your way over? You wanna go find some?
Everyone's talking about orcas for real.
We've actually heard some, you've heard some firsthand accounts.
Yeah.
Of orca attacks.
Yeah. No, and people here have a new thing here is pingers. They're supposed to scare the orcas away. So I talked to a guy yesterday. I was like, "Do you have a pinger?" He's like, "Oh, of course." I said, "Does it work?" He goes, "It's not quite clear. They're not sure if it attracts the orcas or it scares them away, but it does one of the two." So, no, but it's a real thing. So I guess actually they tend to follow. It seems like so they follow the tuna, and right now this time of year they're down by Gibraltar, and then later in the summer they end up moving north up to northern Spain, usually around September. So we don't think we'll have orcas.
Good.
Yeah. I'd love to see an orca, just
not biting our rudder.
not biting our rudder.
Yeah.
Everyone talks about orcas. So it's a weird thing.
Yeah. So for this leg, so the Azores to Spain, what are you doing differently than you did on Newport to Azores?
I think the biggest thing that's different is just how we're preparing food wise.
Yeah.
We're stocking up on soups and miso and dried noodles, that kind of stuff that's just easy.
Like being back in college.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy for me. This is my normal diet.
Yeah.
I think that's very important. Yeah, we just went shopping, and that's what we loaded up on. We also, we had some great winds coming over, and every time we looked at our speed, it was like 6, 7, 8 knots. Right? It looked great. That being said, we still only averaged 5 knots VMG, velocity made good, because you're never going exactly where you want to go. So our weather routers had us at 160 miles a day, because we should be able to do 6.5 knots, and that's the math. But we never were hitting those targets, and actually it was kind of demoralizing because we're like, we're always falling behind. We're letting them down. But so anyway, for this trip, we've planned 120 miles a day. That's what we can do, 5 knots. And I think I've heard it from other people before. Yeah, you should be probably more conservative with your mileage per day than you think you could be in best case scenario. Yeah. Doing much more than 5, at least for our kind of a cruising boat, is not realistic. So anyway, that's our plan, and that maybe is a change from before. It'll help us with our routing. Yeah, and in my case, I have some medication for the seasickness, which I got. Some patches, so I'll be putting those on in a couple hours. And I'm gonna pre-hydrate and really work on that and try to keep my fundamentals good. Eating, trying to sleep, hydrating. Seems super simple, but it's super important.
All right, you can use the Bela method of naps.
I was thinking about you the whole time and wishing I could just close my eyes and fall asleep. No, but the thing is, you tried. I mean, you made an effort to sleep because you know how important.
I made it an effort. That's right.
Yeah, and it is. It's so they say in women's first responder, right? For a patient, you got to keep them fed, hydrated, warm, and rested.
Yep.
It sounds like it's not rocket science. It kind of isn't. The body will do most of the fixing on its own, but you got to give it those fundamental things.
That's right. Yeah, you're very right. I used to, even though I knew I probably wouldn't fall asleep, I would go down below and try to fall asleep, because you know what? I'm going to feel more rested, even if I just fall asleep for 10 minutes. It's going to be help. Yeah. It's going to help in that accumulation, right? Because it's one of these, you make deposits and you make withdrawals.
And I think that's it. So in a long passage, and if you're not used to it, for us it was a little different. We've done 2 or 3 day things. You can push through.
You can power through 2 or 3 days.
Power through a couple days, right? And we've all done it in different ways. And back in college, you did it. And you can do a night. You can do 2 nights, but you can't do a week or 2 weeks. You just start hearing voices.
Yeah. I hear voices all the time. So great. Hey, listen. So when you get to Spain, let's touch base again. Let's do part 2 of the journey across the Atlantic. This was great. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this, and it was really great to see you guys again.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Great to talk about it. Yeah.
You betcha. All right.
Unbelievable story, Bela. And I mean, I think we're both so glad they made it to the first stop safe and sound. What struck you as the most interesting elements of part 2 of this conversation with these 2 guys?
Well, the interesting thing was I was their ground support for this trip. So every day they would send me a text. They had satellite communication capability. They'd send me a text that gave me their position, their heading, sort of the winds that they were encountering, their next waypoint, and then a couple of words about sort of the general condition of what was going on. And 17 days is a long time. I mean, I was on land and I was following them, and man, it's a lot different than sort of the 2 or 3 day coastal cruises that I do. So I think that's just sort of, you got to get comfortable with that part of it, man. It's a long time, and there's no getting off. You get on the ride, and you got to get to the other end. I mean, when you're sailing across the Atlantic, you can stop in Greenland, you can stop in Iceland, and the Azores. That's about it. And Greenland and Iceland are sort of out of the way, and there's a lot of icebergs and stuff, so they're not great places to go to from that perspective. So I think the other thing that sort of struck me was, even with all the preparations they made, I mean, they went over the boat with a fine-tooth comb. They had plans for food and the weather routing, which we talked about in the previous episode. Stuff still broke, right? And part of this is it's 5 years worth of wear and tear crammed into 17 days. And I just thought sort of, their boom vang broke. It pulled right out of the boom vang is something that one end of it's attached to the boom, which is sort of the bottom part of the mainsail, and the other end is attached to the mast. And it helps to manage the angle of the boom, sort of, because it's attached to the mast, and it helps manage the angle of the boom depending upon how the wind is blowing on the sail. And it ripped right out of the bottom of the mast. The rivets just ripped right out. And that's been on, I mean, their boat's like 40 years old. That's been on the boat for 40 years. And then they tried to figure out how to jerry rig that all together.
And there was no way, Bela, there was no way they would have known that, right? I mean, by visually looking at it. I had to look this up, honestly. I didn't know what a boom vang was, but I did look it up. But yeah, it seems like it just failed, right? Internally and externally, it looked fine.
Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, the boom vang is used the most and has the most load on it when you're sailing, typically when you're sailing downwind. Okay. And when I'm bopping around, on coastal cruising, if I'm lucky, a third of the time I'm sailing downwind. When you sail across an ocean, you're hoping that 100% of the time you can be sailing downwind. So if you think about the duty cycle of it, right, it's totally different. Yeah. And that's true for a lot of things on the boat. A lot of the lines are now positioned differently than they are. On a 3-day cruise around the coast, I might sail downwind for half a day, maybe 6, maybe 10 hours. Here, they're doing it 24 hours a day.
Right, so for 10 straight days, and then it fails.
Yeah, right. That plays a role in it, and that plays a role in what fails, because you're stressing things differently than you typically do when you're sort of doing your 2 or 3 day cruises. I thought the story with the set screw was sort of amazing.
Yeah.
Didn't that strike you as I found this screw. I'm not sure where it went.
Where it came from. Right. And we've all had this happen to us on land, right?
Yes.
And it's not that big of a deal, I think, on most cases on land, but that was a big deal,
Yes. Yes.
Oh, it came from another boat, and it's like, no, right.
Right. It didn't fall out of my pocket. It came from somewhere, and it clearly had a purpose. It clearly had a purpose.
Every screw does on a sailboat, doesn't it? Isn't pretty much every screw has a purpose, right?
That's right. The other thing I thought that was kind of neat was when they would get into these stressful situations, they had enough presence of mind to say, okay, take a step back. Let's sit down and analyze what's happening here. We're not in imminent danger. It's not like, we got to do something in the next 5 seconds or we're going to die. Let's pause. Let's hit pause for a second. Let's regain our thoughts. Let's sit down and talk this through as to what our plan of action should be. And I think that's really great advice, because I know I often have this tendency of, something goes wrong. I dive in head first, oftentimes without sort of taking that step back, looking at the big picture and sort of analyzing it and making a well thought out plan as to how I'm going to attack it. I thought that was really good advice.
Yeah, me too. Even looking for the manual to see if they could find a diagram. It didn't work out, but I thought taking that extra step in the moment to try to gain as much information as they had was really, really cool. So I thought I was really impressed by that too, and it did really, really strike me. My last question is, they were planning on this trip and they were going to go to the UK, and now here they are in the Azores, and it looks like the weather's going to be crappy, so they have to go to Spain instead. Now, how would you feel if you were in their shoes? Is this a letdown, or is this like, okay, we're alive and we made it, and Spain's nice too? What's your take on this?
I think it's smart, because this is one of the things where you often hear boaters and private airplane pilots get into trouble because they want to push, because they're trying to get to a certain place and they're trying to get there by a certain time, and the weather turns to crap and bad things can happen. And there's lots and lots of stories about happening with private pilots on airplanes and with sailboats. So I think it's wise, right? The weather patterns are generally known, but within that microcosm, they change, and there's variations to them. And the weather patterns for sailing from Horta up to Ireland weren't great. It was going to be a rough passage. Couldn't they make it? Yeah, probably. Of course they could probably make it, but it's not going to be fun. It's going to be a miserable, 10 days. and who wants to go through that? So they have made a change in their plans. They're going to sail from the Azores to Spain, and then they're going to go from Spain up through the Bay of Biscay, which is an interesting place to be. There's a lot of great stories about sailing there. There's a lot of bad weather situations that happen there, to France, and then from France, the coast of France, over to the UK. So, it's 3 hops. shorter legs, and that's their plan. But I think this is smart. When you get into a situation and you say, you know what, that's not going to be a good trip. So let's change our plans. Let's make it a better trip for us. Now, of course, you have to have the flexibility to be able to do that. And that's why I think whenever I plan a trip, and my trips are short, I always build in at least one extra day into that trip so that I don't have to go out when the weather's crappy. I'm a fair weather sailor. I mean, I admit it. I don't like sailing when it's raining or stormy or the wind's really blowing. I'd rather sit at the marina. And so I always build in an extra day, sometimes 2 extra days for those types of weather situations, or a piece of equipment breaks. And I say, nah, I don't need that piece of equipment. I'll go without it. Well, you know you're going to need it. So I think this is wise in sort of, again, like we talked, taking a step back, not just blindly going, but taking a step back, reassessing this situation, and then making a conscious decision to either change your plan or not to change your plan. Right? That's what I call making a conscious decision, as opposed to just blindly keep going, which is sort of the unconscious decision to keep going on what you originally wanted to do.
Yeah, it makes sense. And this might be totally obvious to all of the listeners, except for me. But I'll tell you that here where I live on this side of the ocean, and even though I'm landlocked, we're not that far from ocean currents. And our weather really is dictated by these ocean weather patterns. And much more so than when I lived in New York or Michigan or anywhere in the Northeast. These patterns come and they sit for a long time, and we'll get the same weather kind of day in and day out for a much longer period of time than we used to, in New York, where these weather fronts kind of come down from Canada or come across the U.S. And they move, right? And we get a lot where things get stuck here, both for good and for bad. So that totally makes sense. I wouldn't have thought about it before I moved here, but it totally makes sense from observing the differences in weather when you're near the Eastern Atlantic, that these patterns really are repetitive and sticky.
Well, there's the thing called the Bermuda high and an Azores high, which is these high pressure systems that just sort of sit, one on top of Bermuda, one sort of on top of the Azores. And high pressure systems rotate clockwise. So if you're north of those high pressure systems, you get a beautiful downwind sail straight across the Atlantic Ocean. And now, there's the same thing can happen if it's the wrong time of the year, that you get low pressure system after low pressure system just zooming across there, and you get just days and days of crappy weather. And low pressure systems rotate counterclockwise. So now you're going into the wind the whole trip. So that's why these things are important. And getting the window right is really important. And a lot of those windows are seasonal. But they're not. It's not like July 1st, it changes. Well, it's somewhere around July 1st, give or take 3 or 4 weeks, it's going to change.
Right? Yeah, and it's less predictable now. We know with the climate changing, right, that these things that used to be a little more predictable are now a little less predictable. So it all adds to the challenges. But this is great. But I'm glad they're making the safer choice too, for sure. And I'm really excited to hear about this next leg of their journey. And do they make it to the UK? And which route do they have to take? And this Bay of Biscay thing sounds a little scary to me, but we'll see how it works out, huh?
Yeah, I will. Once they get good internet connection, I will do another update with them. Probably when they get to the UK would be my guess, or maybe when they get to France. I'm not sure. But we will definitely have a follow-up conversation with Sawyer and Simon.
Great. Well, listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. If you have questions about what we've discussed, as always, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
Hey, and if you enjoyed the podcast, please hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting application. It makes it easier for other people to find the podcast because it sort of elevates us in our visibility. So I'm heading out to the boat this weekend, gonna be there with Elaine, my wife, and our 2 granddaughters for what the granddaughters have coined as Camp Paradox. Paradox is the name of the boat. We did it last year where we had them for a week on the boat, and we're gonna do it again. And I'm looking forward to that next week.
Sounds great, Bela. So from over here in Münster, Germany, I'll see you next time. Safe travels.
Okay.